So hi everyone. I'm Ernesto Pye. I'm a web developer at AmericanEagle.com. I always like to plug this if you are looking for a job or just interested in want to discuss what we do. You can go to our website, AmericanEagle.com, or you can talk to me. I'm happy to tell you about it. I've been there for over a decade now, and I absolutely love it. So this is my intro slide. It's not very fancy. I'm kind of recovering from a cold. I think I can make it a little fancier. Let's do that. It'll make somebody mad. Let's do that. That's a little better. So I'm going to talk about this really kind of prerequisite concept for doing a lot of modern JavaScript development. And I will show some React examples, but this can apply to pretty much any kind of JS development that you're doing. Before I start, I want to show you a little bit of the data that I just sort of set up to kind of help me through some of these exercises. I'm going to focus all through, so it's all going to be just basically going through code. So I'm doing everything through Code Sandbox, which was actually a really nice experience. I've never worked this much with it, and it's great. And so, how many people here are familiar with Smash Brothers? Yeah, awesome. So I didn't want to do like foobar, Baz, whatever. I just basically took a bunch of characters from Smash Brothers and put them into objects. And well, here you go. Here's a bunch of characters with some different properties. So you'll see something like Fox and Falco. They have their own properties here for name, icon, speed. Further down, you'll see I have this roster, which is an array of a few of these different guys here. And then some promises, some other utility stuff that you don't need to worry about. But just sort of be aware that if you look at something like Fox in particular, we're going to focus on him. And think of like name, icon, speed. That's the main properties that he's got. He's got moves too, but we'll worry about that in a little bit. So let's start with object destructuring. So what is object destructuring? Why do we need it? Okay, let's start with just a simple function or just returning a bunch of stuff to the console, right? So let's say that we load up a reference to my Fox object, right? And just do that right at the top there versus const fighter. And then if I wanted to spit out the name and the speed of that character, let me make this a little bit bigger so you guys can see. Okay. I can get the name and the speed. So you can see here, Fox and 10. Nothing crazy, right? I've got an object, and it's got a property name, right? Name or speed. That's fine. That works totally fine. Now, let's say that, and I'm going to need you to use your imagination a little bit, but let's say that I have a little bit more complex logic, and I did something really basic here, where I just check for the speed, and if the speed is 10, then I display the name and the speed. What you'll notice is that the identifier fighter gets repeated a few times. Now, imagine if you have a lot of different conditions and all these different paths, and you want to do all these different function calls and stuff like that. At that point, it might get a little bit, not necessarily messy, but a little bit harder to just follow some basic logic. And so what developers will sometimes do, which is totally valid, is they'll say, okay, I'm going to create a new variable. I'm going to assign it the name, and I'm going to create another new variable for the speed, and I'm going to assign it the speed, right? So that then every time I have to access it later, I just have the reference to that specific property, and then I can say, okay, if the speed is 10, then show me the name and the speed. So it's definitely a little bit more concise, and you can see here, the output is exactly what you would expect. Nothing crazy so far. Now, this is where things get a little more interesting with destructuring. So this is a newer feature. I don't want to get into too much exactly when it was implemented and all that. First of all, because I don't really know. But second, because honestly, most of us, I would imagine, have some kind of Babel setup that kind of does this for you, so you have the ability to have this in your projects most of the time. Me using Code Sandbox, it was already included for me. I don't even have to think too much about it. Even browser support, you can find out about that in MDN. You can see that Internet Explorer, shockingly, doesn't support it, but it doesn't really matter because we have all these wonderful tools these days.
Hey Ernesto.
Yes.
Does Code Sandbox allow you to minimize that bar
Yes,
on the
it does,
left
on the
and maybe
left.
just get a little more space?
There you go. Okay. So, this is the destructuring assignment operator here. And the way this works, and the way that I like to think about it, because when I first saw this syntax, if anybody isn't too familiar with this, basically it's saying from the object fighter, give me the name and the speed. So you're kind of going backwards a little bit. And in fact, just sort of keep this in mind, whenever I write this, I usually, if you try to get IntelliSense for some of the stuff you generally want, it'll try to give you a guess, but it won't really know. If you do this first, and then you say, and you start typing, then it's gonna know for sure that that's what you want because it knows what properties fighter has. So that's just a little tip, just from something that I've ran into so much, because obviously it has no way of knowing until you actually tell it what you're destructuring from. But anyway, all this does is it basically does what we did right above here, right? It creates two new variables for you. They're both constants, and one of them is going to have the name, and one of them is going to have the speed, and it takes those properties from the fighter object. And then all I have to do the rest of my logic is I'm going to check if speed equals 10, then spit out the name and the speed. Pretty easy, right? And if I look at the code being, the console logs here, you're going to see Fox 10 on the right. No problem. So immediately, it's saving me a little bit of space, right? And this may not seem super significant right now, but just keep in mind we really only have a single object, and it's got, right now we're only using two properties. If this got a little more complicated, let's say I wanted to take moves or get the icon and do stuff with those, then this becomes a lot more useful as you scale up. Now, one thing that you can do with destructuring that is really handy, and I've run into this a couple times, is you can rename, basically give the variables you're destructuring into a new name. And let's say you have you have a shadow name that you're overriding, and your linter doesn't let you do that. Hours at work doesn't, for example. Or you just simply have a conflict. You can simply rename by doing the name of the property. So this is the property you're extracting, and then you give it a new name. In this case, I just renamed it fighter name, fighter speed, just for the sake of the example. And then I can compare fighter speed, or fighter speed to 10, and spit out fighter name and fighter speed. Nothing, again, too crazy there. Any questions so far? Okay, awesome. So, default values. So this is where it gets a little more interesting, right? What if I'm destructuring from an object and it's missing certain properties? They are just completely undefined. So if we look under 6 here, we have Fox, and we have the Fox emoji, which I'm spitting out. And if you remember correctly, from before, I basically had the icon set for Fox. But I didn't set it for everybody, right? So let me go back to my utility code, and here's Jigglypuff. You might learn some stuff, like what I think about Jigglypuff. Don't worry about it too much. It's very inside stuff. But he doesn't have an icon, right? There's no icon defined in Jigglypuff. It's undefined. And let's say I still wanted to show something. So if I go back to object destructuring, I can then say, okay, let me change this. Instead of just fighter, I'm going to go Jigglypuff. And now you're going to notice that under exercise 6, Jigglypuff undefined, right? It has no icon. If I want to give it one, I can simply say, I'm going to say, okay, equals, and then, sorry, shit, the correct emoji when talking about Jigglypuff, which apparently won't, well, I'm doing something wrong here. No, I got this.
You could just type poo.
I could.
We'll know.
It's so much better. There we go. And what you'll notice here is that instead of icon being undefined, now it actually has the value that I want to give it. So all you really have to do if you want to give it a default value, add an assignment to it, and you can give it any value you want. Now, one thing to note, and this is going to be a kind of a common theme, this works for undefined values only. Not if you have a null, it's not going to pick that up and replace it. So you kind of have to be aware of that because it may not always work how you expect.
Ernesto,
Yes.
are you assigning that value there or just using it as a reference locally? So if you reference that later, Jigglypuff will always now have that icon.
No, only the icon here, the destructured version, will have that value. Jigglypuff, if you try to do Jigglypuff that icon, it'll still be undefined. It doesn't touch the original reference.
Got it.
It's really a shortcut to like icon equals jigglypuff.icon or shit icon. Poo, sorry.
Poo, poo. Okay.
So, next up is spread operator. And we had to talk about the spread operator before. Hopefully, a few are familiar with this. But essentially, what this does is, you can kind of mix it together with destructuring. So let's say that I wanted to get all the properties besides a single one. And this can be handy in all kinds of different situations. And in React, you might want to extract a certain prop and then pass all the rest down to another component, for example. And here, where you can see, if I show you right here, everything except the icons. You can see Fox, here's the name, the speed, and the moves object, right? But there's no icon. It's not included because it's not part of REST. If I were to add our moves here, for a sec here. What did I? Oh, it's sorry. Okay, let me just. There's a conflict of. That's why. Another example of why renaming is handy. I had something else called me. So right here you can see that now it only has speed and moves. So you can mix these together, and it can be really, really handy in a lot of scenarios in JavaScript. And this is where things get a little dicey. So you can do nested objects with destructuring. And what you'll notice, and at least in my opinion, and again, there's no right or wrong way. You can pretty much do any of these, even whatever I did at the very top here. There's no right or wrong, right? These are all completely valid ways of just getting your data out. Destructuring just is a helper. That's pretty much what it is. It's just another tool in the tool belt. If you look at this, you can imagine what might happen if I started having more objects nested and objects nested and objects nested and objects. Nothing. You could theoretically use destructuring for it, but it might start getting a little hard to read. So you kind of have to figure that out by yourself and with your team what works best. But what I'll show you here is I have this. I can extract the moves from Fox. I can also give moves a default object, and this is where it gets interesting. One of the things when I was learning destructuring in JavaScript is I would do this, and then I would say, hey, I want moves. Why can't I get a reference to moves? Like not just the properties below it, but I want the whole thing for whatever reason. It turns out the way to do that is you simply add another entry here when you're destructuring, and that will give you the entire object. And then an important thing to differentiate here is you can give default values to individual values in the object itself, or you can create a default value for the whole thing. So if all of moves is empty, it'll get some kind of default object. Okay? All right. So that's object destructuring. Here. Let's go to array destructuring. So I found like a couple practical examples for this, not a ton, but where it is handy, it is super handy. And I'll just explain kind of really quick how this works. It's very similar to object destructuring. So remember rosters, an array that has Fox, Falco, all the guys in there. And the old way, I would just do, hey, I'm going to grab the first item from the array, and then the second item, just show the properties. Right? Scroll up here a little bit. All right. And it shows you Fox and Falco. Just fine. The other option, again, is create your own temporary variables, extract those, and then display them. You could do other things, obviously. You could check, make sure the length is what you're expecting. You can do all kinds of stuff like that. And this kind of, I didn't want to do it here because that kind of gets into default values a little bit if you're dealing with arrays of reasonably known size. And so for destructuring, again, just like with objects, you essentially are creating a new array, and then you're telling it, hey, the first element of that array you're going to get from roster. And the second one you're going to get from there as well. It's going to be the first one from roster is Fox, the second one from roster is Falco. And then everything else would get put in a separate array called others. Very similar to the rest that I did for the spread operator before. And so if we look here at what's spit out under 3, you're going to see that there's Fox, Falco, and then 3, which is the length of the others. And if I do others, you actually get to see them here. Here's the other 3 objects. Here's Marth, Captain Falcon, and Jiggly. Okay? Now, default values apply to arrays as well. So if you wanted to, if you knew you had an array of, let's say, potentially between 2 and 3 values, and you just didn't know for sure, but you wanted to be able to destructure those values into actual named variables, you can simply say, okay, I'm going to get the first value from the first element in the array, the second from the second, and for the third, if there isn't a value, I'm going to give it a default value of 30. And so if I can show you the output here, 10, 20, 30, despite only having an array with 10 and 20. Now, again, this is important. I believe if I were to do this, like that will give me null, because null doesn't count as an undefined, so the default value doesn't apply to it. I actually it didn't quite click with me until I learned that while doing this exercise. I think I knew that sort of, like I kind of knew it, but I didn't really know it. And anyway, that's one thing I learned by doing this. So that was cool. And finally, again, this is just like with nested objects. I mean, I don't usually run into scenarios like this with the code I write. You could have nested arrays with nested arrays inside of them. Again, you can still do all the same stuff with destructuring as long as you kind of follow the same structure as what the target object has. And you can see here, C, D, E, F, 1. So it's got 1, 2, 3, and then 999, which is the default value. It's just a slightly more contrived example to kind of show you that it's possible. Again, readability, kind of up to you. You might choose to do something like, I want to extract this into its own, separate array, and then based on that, destruct separately. It's up to you. But I just wanted to show that it's definitely doable. Any questions?
Yeah. What would happen if you were to destruct more items that are in the array? So, like, for example, for roster, I was looking at like line 16. So if you have like roster, for example, if there's only, let's say, one element in roster, what's falco do?
It'll give you undefined.
It'll give you undefined. Okay.
So if you look at this one here, there's only 2 elements in the array, and I'm actually getting 3. So if I just take this out, you're going to see 10, 20, undefined.
I see. Okay.
Any other questions? Okay. Cool. So this is my maybe don't slide, I guess.
Here, Ernesto.
Yes.
Can you kill the sidebar?
Oh,
Can
sorry.
you zoom it in? Some
Keep
folks
forgetting.
back here are having trouble seeing.
The
Oh,
old man can't see.
can I make it a little bigger? Let's see if I remember.
My
right.
friend, I'm asking for my friend.
Is that a little better? I zoomed in a little bit too.
Yeah. More, can you do it more? Or?
That's my friend.
Could try the light thing with them. I'll turn invisible, which might be a cool.
No, I think if you can work with that, I think
Yeah, I
you're
can do
probably
that.
good.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. All right about that, guys. Okay, so maybe don't. Totally can if you want to. I learned this cool kind of neat little trick where if you have 2 variables and I remember the last time I swapped variables was years ago, probably in like college, where they tell you here you have variable A and variable B and you want to swap the values between them. And depending on what you're dealing with, there's all these tricks you can do, XOR tricks, and if you have numbers you can add, and anyway, you can do all kinds of stuff. But if you're in JavaScript land, you can do this. And essentially what you do is you create a new array that deconstructs an array with the values flipped, and this will assign the values backwards for you. So as you can see here, initially A is 1, 2, 3, and then B is 4, 5, 6, and they're backwards. That's a thing. Maybe don't do it. Totally up to you. I haven't ran into a situation where I need to flip values in a while, so but that's just something that's totally possible. I never really thought too much about doing this. You can mix and match, so you don't have to just do objects or just do arrays. You can do arrays within objects within arrays, and you can. This is just a really simple example. Again, just because a tool exists doesn't mean you have to use it. So if your code starts to get a little bit weird, if for some reason you're not using Pretty or you're going to have a terrible time formatting everything, we might want to reconsider a little bit of how you're formatting your code. So just kind of keep that in mind. All right, so let's go back here. Okay, now, this is where it gets a little more interesting. And so, the destructuring assignment works. It's really handy in a lot of cases, but where it really shines sometimes is when you're dealing with functions and function arguments. So I created a really simple function that takes a fighter and then it wants to display the details for that fighter. If for some reason I don't have certain values, I want to display defaults. And by the way, I totally lifted this from MDN and I just renamed it a little bit. MDN is awesome, but the point stands that if you wanted to check if the fighter was provided because of JavaScript's nature and because we're not using something like TypeScript that might yell at us a little more aggressively, you have to say, hey, if fighter is undefined, give me a brand new object. Otherwise, use fighter. you can go even further, you can check that it's actually an object, you can do all kinds of stuff, but let's just keep it simple. Then let's say that if the name property is undefined, give me default, otherwise give me the, and the same for the icon. If it's undefined, give me the poo emoji, otherwise just give me the actual values that were passed. And where you would see this all the time would be in like, I remember like a long time ago looking at jQuery plugins and you would have,
The whole first part of it would
yeah,
be
it's just a
checking
massive
the options.
object. And it went from like something like this to then object.assign stuff to get some of the default ones, which worked okay. But now we don't actually need to worry about this. So what you'll see on the right here, I'm displaying the details. So here's Fox's details and the Jigglypuff's details, right? Again, remember that Jigglypuff doesn't have an icon, so this default is what's coming into play, right? So it displays the correct icon on the right. Now, I call it the new way, but it's just using destructuring. I can simply say, and this is without default values just yet, so it doesn't quite cover everything that the previous one does. From the finder, just give me the name and the icon, right? And it'll display them as you would expect as well. But now, of course, I don't have any default values, so I'm going to have an undefined icon. So I'm going to keep going further down a little bit. Actually, right. I had this in here as a null example, like what happens if you try to do this and you don't actually have an object that you're passing through. It won't work even if you set a default. If you do something like this, that won't work, right? But because I'm doing this, it's just undefined, I would have to set a default here. But again, all the actual properties would be undefined, so I just decided to move further down. Here's a new way with default values, and this is a little bit, sorry, prettier. Okay, here we go. And so here's the new way of doing it, right? I can either extract the two properties that I care about, name and icon, and if I happen to not have a value for an actual object entirely, so if I were to call it like I was doing it before, like this, right, with no parameter being included, it's simply going to use this. And then I can show you a couple calls here, right? And what's going to happen is, here's Fox, and Jigglypuff doesn't have an icon. We'll look at that. But if we didn't pass anything, it does give me the default value, so that's good. So, who can tell me why Jigglypuff doesn't have an icon?
Because you didn't give Jigglypuff an icon.
I didn't. It's true. It didn't deserve it. It doesn't deserve it. What's that?
It had a name property, or an icon property.
No, it has the object, but it doesn't have icon. And you haven't defaulted the value for icon.
Right, so if I wanted to just give it a default value there, just do that, and if I can get the...
We're going to do this again?
I'm going to do it every time. Every time. And so, hey, now we get it on the right, you can see that it actually gets a value, right? But you can see that just how much cleaner this is. And depending on your code, like, I personally, I don't usually create default objects like this. A lot of the times we'll just, we use TypeScript a lot, so if you basically wouldn't be able to pass something like this, it just wouldn't be a valid call to our function. But if you did, you certainly could use this as one way to add robustness to your code. So yeah. And then, a couple practical examples. This was probably my favorite, promise.all. If you ever deal with promise.all, you're gonna know that you give it an array of promises, and it's going to return an array of either resolved or rejected promises in the same order that you provided them in. So if I say, hey, give me Fox and give me Falco, and I try to wait on promise.all, the old way would be, hey, you know what, give me the first value in the array, and then give me the second value. Okay, nothing really wrong with this, right? But whenever, at least for me, it always felt kind of gross to do this in my code. I don't know why, it just didn't feel right. What you can do now instead is say, you know what, get Fox and Falco, create a new array, destructure from promise.all, and then spit out the values, right? And you can see that it works just how you would expect. So this is probably one of my favorite uses for this. I use, pretty frequently. And this one, again, also from MDN, this is regular expression parsing. You'll see that there's a few matches here. So there's one there for the host, one here for the, for the protocol for the host, and then for the path. If I think I have it commented out here. And let me, and if I were to here return, you can see here it's returning HTTPS. because it's being passed this HTTPS developer Mozilla URL. This one I didn't even change. Don't hate me too much. I'm going to go ahead and change that, and you can see that it gives you the other value. So one thing that you can learn from this is if you don't care about a certain value that you don't want to destructure, just don't give it an identifier, and it just won't be, it'll just ignore it. So in this case, it'll ignore the first one, which I believe is the full string with regis. And I guess I have to find out. Let's see what it is. I can't remember.
I think you lost your bracket, yeah.
Oh, did I? Thank you. I'll have an extra one. There we go. Yeah, there we go. So it's a full, oops. I lost everything. There we go. You can see it gives you the full one, but if I don't care about that, I can just simply get rid of it. That was also something that I learned. I just never really needed it, but hey, if you ever have a chance to use that, there you go. Now on to some basic React stuff. So, you know, all the stuff that I've talked about, you can apply it in so many different things in React. Let me see if I can find the, okay, there we go. Yeah, okay. So I created a really simple React app. All it does is it just takes a roster and spits it out into UI. Nothing crazy. My default component that I have is called fighter display. So in React, we take, basically this is the basis of React, right? You have a function, and your UI is a result of the function plus some state, right? In this case, we don't have state, we just have props. But we essentially take the props, which in this case just has a fighter object, and then we display it. And what you can see here is that I do props.fighter.name, and then I check props.fighter.icon, and I'll check if it has a value, and if it doesn't, well, you know what happens. And then I can show the speed. And again, this is totally fine. There's really nothing wrong with it, but it's really repetitive. And with some of the components we've had where they can get a little bit larger, it can be kind of hard to read. So for something like this, I'd rather just destructure, and you can see that you know, I can give it default values. I can essentially do everything we did with functions, because again, components are just functions. And and there you have it. I mean, you can do this with classes as well. You can just destructure on this.props when you're in your render method. So the same thing would apply. And yeah, also this is totally cool too. If you want to like keep the reference to the full props, you can do that as well. I've done this sometimes. Sometimes it feels a little cleaner, especially if you need the reference to the original props object. This is one way to do it. If you need to like forward it to another component or something like that, you could totally do that as well. And now moving forward. So, and this is one thing, if you're doing React and you're using the latest stuff, so hooks, which by the way I absolutely love. We're using them every day, and it's just, I'm just so productive with them, it's crazy. You can't really run away from destructuring. Like the first thing you're gonna see is, if you're using state, you're gonna see use state, and then you're gonna see this, right? All this is doing is taking the first value from the use state call, and the second value, and assigning them to two different variables that you can use. And all this does is it just selects, right? So nothing special here. But just be aware that you kind of can't run away from this stuff. It's pretty much embedded in all of React. And I wanted to show another example, which was with like stateful components, because a lot of people still use those, and that's totally fine too. I just had to put this together kind of really quickly. I've been sick for most of the week, and well, anyway. But you can use your imagination, right? You have this state object that has a whole bunch of properties, and you want to extract only some of them. Just go ahead and destructure, and it'll keep your code a little bit cleaner. Now, that's not to say that sometimes it's nice to know what's a problem, what state. Again, you got to work with your team to figure out what works best for you in different scenarios. We have some people that prefer to always destructure. We have some people that don't like to ever destructure, and that's okay. Like it's not really something that we should potentially stop code review from going through or anything like that. But it's again just another cool tool that you have available. So yeah, that's it. If you want more reading, MDN is amazing. Is that my timer?
No.
Because that'd be awesome. So yeah, MDN. All the details are here, and it's written by way smarter people than me. So check it out.
So not W3 schools?
Oh, I mean, well, that's if you're really advanced. Then you go to W3 schools. I actually totally checked out.
If you want to look at, if you want to learn SEO, that's where you go.
Yeah, right. And SQL for some reason. This is great. But yeah, just Google this guy, you'll get it. And you can learn more. So,
Stupid question. Can you learn React without understanding this?
yeah, totally. You totally can. You don't have to understand it. I mean,
Yeah.
you can.
Well, no.
And Joe, I'm
You-
asking
you-
for a friend,
I wouldn't
because
recommend-
no, I'm not doing it.
I wouldn't recommend it. I think this is a really good thing to know, especially if you're reading other people's code. Like, so many people will use this. That's going to be a big roadblock.
So you say it was a best practice for React development?
This
Yeah,
is
I
the best
mean,
practice
just
for
JavaScript.
JavaScript.
Yeah, it's a JavaScript thing in
Hey,
general.
look, we still support IE10, shut up.
Well, this is, I mean, you could visualize how to transpile this to
Absolutely.
ES3
Yeah,
even.
no.
This
I
is
think-
not like symbols or what are the other ones that you can't really, I don't know. There's a bunch that like it's really difficult to, but this is just shorthand. This is just nice sugar. There's no reason not to use it.
But not IE11.
No. Well, I mean, we're transpiling,
Yeah,
so
it doesn't matter. That's why I mentioned, like, if you go to MDN, they'll actually tell you, it doesn't really support, like, IE doesn't support it, if you go way to the bottom here. But it doesn't matter. Like, a lot of this stuff we don't really care about anymore, because of all the tools we have. The app we have at work, it's a, React, TypeScript, all this great new stuff. We run it on IE, because we have to support it as well,
Yeah.
unfortunately. But that's just, that's just how it goes. And yeah, it's not really an issue.
Okay.
So, yeah, so any questions, comments? Cool. All right. Thanks, everyone.